Okay. Hello and welcome.
To a brief history of the FIFA World Cup as a business.
With me, Dr. Kevin Tennant.
And me, Dr. Alex G. Gillett.
So, a little about us. We've been running our blog, Soccer Mad Boffins, for about 6, maybe even 8 years now.
Yeah. On this blog, we put a lot of our thoughts and ideas about the history of football, in particular the FIFA World Cup, and also it's the best place to find news about our publications, which we're working on all of the time.
Yeah, and we try and keep it updated as regularly as possible, as much as work allows, essentially. So, in this short video then, or short recording, we wanted to talk about some of the big issues that we capture and we talk about in our chapter in the new book on the FIFA World Cup. So our chapter talks about the history of the FIFA World Cup and how it developed over time. So it's always been a competition which has been the senior men's competition. It's been a progression from the Olympic football tournament. So the Olympic football tournament started first, and then FIFA broke away in 1930 and started the senior men's competition based on the idea of a world championship for soccer. But what's really important is that it's always been a commercial entity for FIFA. So you'll find a lot of coverage about the extent to which it's a business and how this has become more important over time. But it's really important to realize that this competition has always been very important to the way that FIFA is funded.
Yeah, so the income from the FIFA World Cup, and originally I think that was mainly gate revenue, was the big revenue stream that would fund FIFA's operations for a few years, for the 4-year cycle basically between World Cups, and FIFA at that time didn't have as much overhead as it has today, but they would they administrated, they had an office to keep. Postage costs, because things were done through the mail, through the post in those days. And it grew basically over time. And as the World Cup grew, FIFA grew as well. By the mid 1960s, in 1966 specifically, the World Cup was hosted in England. And one of the key moments of that is that there was more emphasis placed on the kind of merchandising and commercialization. And the English Football Association, which was organising the tournament, they were involved and through firms set up to do this with licensing the England 1966 World Cup brand through products and services. And we see the introduction of arguably the first really notable global sports tournament mascot, World Cup Willie, who was a lion character. And he lent himself to soft toys, T-shirts, bottles of beer. There was even a song about him. Lots of different products and services and entertainment aspects around this. After that, FIFA got a bit more assertive about the branding and merchandising themselves, and got more involved with that rather than leaving it to the host committee to sort of organise and profit from.
Yeah, so one of the reasons that the English were so interested in encouraging the merchandising side as well was that right from the start of the World Cup, one of the important aspects of it was always that the risk of hosting was carried by the host country. So FIFA would make a contract with the host country where the host country would agree to take on the financial risks of hosting the tournament. Essentially, FIFA would be given a percentage, usually about a quarter or between a quarter and a half of the gate revenues cumulatively over the tournament, which would then help to keep the FIFA organisation going over time. And this shows how financially stable and how financially viable the World Cup was, even in the eras when it was basically funded by only gate revenue. So until the mid 1960s, really, most of the money for the tournament basically came through the gate revenues. And in the 1930s, you had no broadcasting income at all. It was all gate revenue. But what's really important to think about are the things that have continued through the tournament. So it's always been an important business to FIFA. It's always been a thing that they've franchised out, if you like, to the host country. But over time, the degree to which the tournament has been monetized has increased. So it's not that the monetization is new, which is sometimes a narrative that's presented. It's just that it's increased over time.
Yeah, and the FIFA organization itself has grown. I guess it's always strived for a kind of bigger, better, more kind of drive going on at all times. There just seems to be the nature of a lot of things in business and with football governance, which arguably is registered not for profit, I think technically, but is it's been increasingly sort of business-like or financialized. It's pursued growth and growing its markets, as we will show.
Yeah. So all of the tournaments have been relatively big in the time at which they took place. So each tournament has to be considered in its own context. So there's a lot of interest in the kind of project management literature in the ways in which the World Cup has grown, and it absolutely has. It's still important to realize, though, that each tournament is proportionally big in its period. So Brazil in 1950, for example, in Brazil at that time, they built 4 new stadiums, even though if we look at the GDPs per capita of some of the host nations, if we look through those, and in the chapter we do this in much more detail, so you can see there that we've managed to find a GDP per capita US dollar figure for each host nation since 1930. So we provide a figure for that. Of those, the poorest was Brazil in 1950, which had a GDP per capita then of only 2,236 US dollars, 2010 dollar equivalent, sorry, 2011 dollar equivalent. And so that demonstrates that, relatively speaking, Brazil was relatively much poorer, for example, than when it later hosted in 2014. So there's always been an expectation that a relatively high investment will take place proportionally in stadiums, even if it's kind of just reusing existing stadiums. But actually some of the earliest World Cups, so Uruguay and Brazil, for example, saw quite a lot of bespoke stadium investment as well.
And for contrast here, we've also shown the wealthiest host, relatively speaking, is the USA 1994 in the 2011 dollar equivalent. That's $38,000, $807 GDP. So I guess absolutely that's the wealthiest in fact as well. But I say relatively because relative to the more recent dollar rate. It wasn't with inflation and so on. But the 1994 tournament was an important one in kind of the business history of the World Cup as well. And we've done a paper on that. We'll come back to this in a few moments. So since the 1970s, we think really the 1966 World Cup, which we've written about in other publications, was kind of at the fulcrum of change. And by the mid-70s, there was changes in the leadership at FIFA and the approach, and the kind of the monetization, financialization really kind of takes off, and it's commercialized to a greater extent. And FIFA gradually claimed more sponsorship and merchandising rights after 1974, which it helped to fund the kind of globalization of FIFA, the inclusion of more FAs from around the world, more nations represented in the World Cup tournament, getting more of a vote and a say in FIFA. The USA '94 then was we see it as kind of in a time of innovation for the World Cup. In some ways, it was revenue maximization was the business model, and perhaps more North American approach to sponsorship, tiered packages of ticketing that were released, asserting kind of legal rights over intellectual property and merchandising, and doing a lot of that, finding legal ways to do that themselves and trademarking things. It was another big change really, and it's held up as being kind of in some ways peak, up until that time at least, peak commercialization, and was a very watched and very profitable tournament as well, in comparison to other World Cups. But growth of FIFA and the World Cup wasn't just about the men's game. Women's football tournaments had been held since at least the 1970s. But the first FIFA sanctioned events, when FIFA get on board with this, they're showing more interest through the 1980s. And in 1991, there's a sanctioned FIFA Women's World Cup. And this is consistent with branching out into other areas, different age groups of males or females, indoor football or five-a-side football, and beach soccer. These were all developed and came through and grew more so later on with some of those. But they were held around the world, and where these tournaments were held was often used as a test bed, as market development of football in some of those territories, but also as practice or a test bed for future hosted men's World Cups. So if a men's World Cup is hosted in a new country, it might be possible a few years before that to see that they hosted an under-21s tournament or this kind of thing, or women's World Cups and so on.
And also, this leads us on to Qatar. So what we find quite interesting about is reflecting on the Qatar event in kind of historic perspective, if you like, is that the Qatar is probably more comparable with the sizes of territories that have previously held the beach soccer World Cup, in that you only need, which I think was once held in Tahiti, for example. So you only need one pitch. All you need is a kind of temporary pitch with some sand in it on one side. And that is considered sufficient to hold the beach soccer World Cup. You can hold all of the matches there. It's a relatively small competition in some ways, although the last event was actually held in Moscow last year. However,
in the chapter, we've got the figures, the facts to compare these tournaments and show which are the most expensive to put on, which are the cheapest and easiest. And, we can see the beach football World Cup, beach soccer World Cup is the most straightforward and the cheapest to host.
Yes. So when it comes to looking at Qatar, you're kind of looking at holding a full-scale men's World Cup. Still the biggest competition by some way in monetary terms. You're looking at hosting that World Cup in a territory which has only previously held things on the scale of the Beach World Cup. So it'll be quite interesting to see how this goes, because obviously we've seen attempts, for example, particularly in Japan, South Korea, the US, to broaden soccer's markets using the World Cup. We've seen it being held in developing countries and different geographies. The norm has become to build bespoke stadiums, and obviously this is not a challenge financially for Qatar, except that obviously the tournament is a month long, and then after the 1 month is over, then there's the questions of what you do with the stadiums. So there are issues inherent with this, maybe. So it's a very large event still potentially, but it's being held in a relatively small territory. Yeah. And it'd be interesting to see how that turns out.
In terms of, other things to think about with the sort of business side of it, well, a broader issue is the change in the calendar. For practical reasons, it's hosted in where in the kind of Western Hemisphere is our winter, and this makes a change. Traditionally, the FIFA World Cup was held in what would be the winter in the Western Hemisphere. Even though we've seen the World Cup kind of hosted, even since its earliest days, between the Americas and particularly in South America and Europe.
And we thought we would just give a brief idea of our some of our kind of previous work, which we recommend that you look at if you're interested in these issues. So our most recent paper, if you're interested in the USA 94 issue, our most recent paper in Project Management Review looks in more depth.
Public Management Review.
Public Management Review. So did I say? Yeah. Sorry. Public Management Review goes into more depth around the USA 94 tournament and the ways in which voluntary bodies came together with sporting bodies and public bodies to hold the tournament and to organise the tournament.
Yeah, so even though there's been big business and big kind of for-profit motives behind some of the hosting decisions and the merchandising and spin-off business stuff, there's also been space in that where the market maybe isn't serving things or where it just makes sense to use not-for-profits, like in the USA 94 case. So that's what that paper's all about, the San Francisco Bay Area hosting, which is done through a local not-for-profit organization to bid, host, and then develop a legacy, usually in the form of financial grants to community groups. That's our most recent paper.
And often in some of our other papers, we've looked at the work that we did on England in 1966, which is the World Cup that we've probably looked at in the most depth because we did a big project on it a few years ago. So in our 2021 chapter, we looked at the kind of the political side of the World Cup, and we brought some comparisons of that out to Russia in the more modern frame. But it was clear at the time of the 1966 World Cup that the Labour government at the time were trying to support that World Cup in a soft way, really. So it wasn't a major kind of political thing in a capital P way. It wasn't kind of at the front and centre of Harold Wilson's domestic agenda, but certainly what they were doing was they were using it for diplomatic advantage. They were using it to try to encourage British exports and to try to encourage a better view of Britain around the world. And what was quite interesting about this was that, as we show in the 2019 paper, in fact, actually, that we published in Soccer and Society, this image backfired somewhat. So the reaction to the World Cup in some Latin American countries, particularly in Brazil and Argentina, was that the kind of reaction to what had happened on the field in the tournament, those kinds of things, was actually something that the British Foreign Office had to get involved in and which actually caused diplomatic fallout. So the tournament was partly successful, as the government thought it would be, in terms of improving the UK's soft image, but it wasn't universally so. And this is one side of the World Cup. On the other side of it, we looked also in our 2019 paper entrepreneurship in both the 1966 and 1994 ways in World Cups, and the ways in which the organisers of those quite different tournaments really sought to try to make more money than from just the football, essentially, around those tournaments. So we see in 1996 that idea of getting into merchandising starting to emerge in an active way and all sorts of products being brought out. In 1994, that happened as well, but there was more of a realization as well of the kind of the legal value of the World Cup and and that was fused together with the kind of the marketing. So there was much more of an assertion of the kind of the brand and the property rights around it. And these ideas had moved on quite a lot from 1966 by this time. So those two made quite an interesting comparison.
So we hope you enjoy reading our chapter, and that you will also perhaps find some value in these other papers we've written, which I think are all cited in the chapter and part of what we're saying. So if you're interested in the decision-making, motives, institutional influences, the branding, project management, the business history of the FIFA World Cup, it's all in the chapter. And we think that it's a really good grounding for what follows in the rest of the book, and for anyone who wants to research the business of the FIFA World Cup historically or up to date, having this grasp of where it's come from and what's been happening business-wise, we think's really interesting, and we hope that you find it useful.
Yeah. So please go and have a look at the chapter and download some of these works as well.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. And we hope you enjoyed this short podcast as well. Bye for now.